This video is brought to you by CUBEAMAJIGS Series 2. If you watched Bill's product review, you already know how sweet these reusable booster packs are. They're made out of durable plastic and they feature art from a ton of talented Magic artists. The Kickstarter is ending tomorrow, so if you want to get a set for yourself, click on the link in the description below to check them out. Seriously, don't sleep on this, they're only available until August 12th. And now, on with the video. So often in Commander games, I see people make plays without assessing how their actions will impact the game. In really broad strokes, there are two ways that any given game action can affect players at the table. On the balance, for each player, the same action can be good or bad. Sounds simple, right? What if I told you that the same action, even a symmetrical one, can be a good or bad idea depending on the commanders at the table or even depending on what's on the board? That's the core of what we're talking about today. I'm Jim, I'm your Spike on the mic, and today we're talking about Turn 0 threat assessment and contextual analysis in Commander. I love Commander more than any other format, and these multiplayer dynamics are the main reason why. This is something that I firmly believe you should learn even if you're not trying to be the winningest player around, because being able to accurately predict the consequences of your actions or another player's actions can be useful even if the thing you're trying to do isn't winning. The very first thing that you can do in a game is take stock of the other decks at the table. This is something that gets easier as you get more experienced playing against different commanders, but the question I like to ask myself is, what are my opponents trying to do? When someone presents a commander like Atraxa, Lost but Seeking, the safe money is on a hard ramp deck, potentially with a landfall theme. The same goes for any of the Omnaths or something like Golos, tireless pilgrim. If you see a Sir Conrad, you can bet that there's going to be a lot of things going into and out of the graveyard. A lot of the time we do this automatically, but making a point to acknowledge it can help you properly contextualize the plays those players are making later in the game. Later on in this episode, we're going to be referring to this as Turn 0 threat assessment. This is taking stock of all of the information you have access to before you even draw your opening hand. The next step, once the in-game action ramps up, is to think about each play within the specific context of all of the information you've collected so far in the game. Does this play move me closer to or farther from accomplishing my goals? What does it do for my opponents? Essentially, threat assessment is the process of constantly asking yourself, who does this benefit? I'd also go so far as to recommend that you talk about these things actively in a game. If you see that a play is disproportionately benefiting one of your opponents, make sure that the other two people at the table know about it. It can be a bit of a slog to sit through some stacks pieces, but if they're stopping the game from ending on the spot, you might have a better chance later on if you leave it for now. Today, Alex is joining me to chime in with his thoughts on the topic. Hey, Alex, thanks for joining me today.
Anytime, Jim.
I brought you on because, as you heard in the prelude to this episode, we want to take a look at how some of these Turn 0 threat assessment concepts can actually work in practice. So this is going to be a little bit different. We're actually going to pull up a few sample commanders and we'll put them on the screen as we talk about them. And we'll talk about what kind of information that we get from just by virtue of the fact that somebody's playing them, and then how that's going to inform our choices in the game. Or maybe not even our choices, but they'll inform what we expect to happen as a result of different game actions. So
that makes sense to me.
Alex, which one did you want to talk about first?
Well, I think we should go with the tried and true Atraxa. I feel like that's a commander that most people see at their local game night. I feel like it's a very popular commander, having been reprinted recently. And frankly, I just think it's the type of card that a lot of people are concerned about, but also used to.
For sure. And, Atraxa is actually kind of an interesting case study because I find that the builds are fairly evenly split between two major and fairly different builds. So one of the real obvious ones is Super Friends, where you're using Atraxa's proliferate ability to proliferate the loyalty counters on your planeswalkers. So the idea is you're playing planeswalkers, then just at end of turn, you just get an extra loyalty counter on each planeswalker every turn. And the other one is Infect. This one, we have an episode on Infect, so if you want to listen to that one, it's up in the old doodly doo there. But Infect, the idea is you're going to toss out like one poison counter to each person using what's the one? Is it Plague Rats?
Plague Rats sounds right. Yeah.
Plague Rats, or one, just an Infect creature. I'll toss some Infect creatures on here. And then once you've got the one poison counter on somebody, barring any intervention by leeches, the Atraxa just being out puts a clock on the game, because if you can get one poison counter on it, then just keep Atraxa out for 10 turns. Doesn't matter what you're doing, you're going to win by virtue of poison.
Yeah, I think Atraxa is the type of commander that, even though it's not necessarily a Voltron strategy in the traditional sense where you're trying to suit it up and win through commander damage, it's very much a linchpin commander. Mm-hmm. It's the type of card that when you see it come down into the field of play, you automatically know that that's something that probably needs to get answered, not necessarily immediately, but in short order.
Yeah. So what we can actually do is, when we sit down against an Atraxa, we can say, okay, what are the likely things we're likely to play against? And if it's not an Atraxa deck that you're familiar with playing against, you can ask. There's nothing wrong with asking. The person might offer it up freely, even if you don't ask. They might say, hey, this is my Atraxa Super Friends deck. And then okay, they're playing Super Friends. But this is the information that you get before you've even drawn your opening hand, before you've played your first card, before you see them cast their first spell. So the whole idea behind this threat assessment concept is the fact that certain game actions look different in different contexts. So the idea is, you're taking a look at what's going on at the table, even the board state. We're going to do a lot of these, agnostic of board state, because those types of analyses tend to be very complicated, and I just don't have time to explain an entire board state of a turn 8 EDH game.
Well, you don't want to be here for 2.5 hours?
Yeah, exactly. Well, this person has a curse totem, and this person, But with Atraxa, if let's go with the first one. Let's say a board wipe, Wrath of God, right? Or Toxic Deluge, or Fire Covenant, or whatever, right? This is an effect that, strictly speaking, is symmetrical. It's symmetrical because it tells all of the players to perform the same game action, which is destroy all of their creatures. That being said, it's not symmetrical in practice, because either some people have broken the symmetry by building their decks with fewer creatures, or they just are less affected by board wipes than other decks might be. So an example of that might be Marin, as an example, or any heavy reanimator strategy. If you destroy all their creatures, they're fairly accessible in the graveyard to get them back. So that's more of a soft board wipe for them. Whereas if you're playing, my Annex and Cymede Soldiers deck, if I've got a board full of tokens and I hit a board wipe, that's devastating, right? Those tokens ain't coming back.
Well, so, it's sort of like the idea of, similarly to if you had a Zabaz modular deck and you see somebody rip a Price, not a Price of Progress, a Bane of Progress.
Yeah.
Although a Price of Progress would also be bad, off the top. And so from my perspective, I think you're absolutely right. There are different vagaries of how these pieces come together, but we can make some basic assumptions about what we're dealing with based on the commander just itself, along with some typical early plays as well. Mm-hmm. Right? For example, just like you said with Atraxa here, one of the things that I would look for as a opponent of an Atraxa player is, do they play an early thing like, say, Interplanar Beacon versus something like Karn's Bastion? Karn's Bastion doesn't really give me any information other than that they want additional proliferate counters, which isn't that terribly unique. But if instead I see something like Interplanar Beacon come down, now I know that I probably need to start looking for Planeswalker removal, options for evasive creatures, or just get some counter spells going in my hand, even if I have to tutor one up, to try and prevent something big like, say, an Ugin the Spirit Dragon from hitting the table.
Yeah, and so that's the kind of thing that can inform your early plays, right? Because, like you say, if you've got signals from your opponents, if they're giving signals that they're going to start dropping Planeswalkers maybe on turn 3, that maybe rather than ramping on your early turns, maybe you want to consider dropping a couple cheaper creatures if you've got them in your hand. Whereas you might prioritize it the other way if you didn't have that kind of signal. Because even like a 2/2 on the board, if every player at the table has a 2/2 and somebody drops a planeswalker, it pretty much doesn't matter what planeswalker it is. It's not surviving a full turn cycle, right?
Yeah. No.
And for the most part, if the only value that an Atraxa player is getting out of a planeswalker is one activation, like they're not gonna run away with the game.
Yeah, no.
Right.
Realistically, the rate on planeswalkers is such that if you play it and minus it and then it gets removed, you basically got value. Mm-hmm. But if you play it and plus it and then it gets removed, you probably didn't get value.
Yeah.
And so that's more or less the thing that you need to look at when you're looking at these types of decks. Especially from the like turn 0 perspective, though. This is the type of deck that I feel like most people should be honest with you about. Like, the difference between Atraxa Super Friends and Atraxa Infect is pretty massive, in my opinion, in terms of the pace of the game. You're probably not going to see the same types of decks against these types of cards. And so, from my perspective, Atraxa, while very common and sort of a boogeyman, especially to a lot of lower power players, should be able to get the information you need ahead of the game. Mm-hmm. In terms of what you need to be prepared for.
Yeah, especially if it's something that you're not going to enjoy playing against, right? Like if you've got a hard stop on Infect, if you say like, that's one of my boundaries, for I don't want to play against Infect, right? And I mean, some people don't, right? We know that. But that's the kind of thing that not only if you're the Atraxa player and you're playing Infect, you should be forthcoming with that, knowing that a lot of people don't like Infect. But also, if it is one of your hard boundaries, you should be asking.
Yeah, exactly.
Or bringing it up ahead of time, saying something like, hey, I know you're playing Atraxa. If it's Infect, do you maybe have a different deck that you brought? Because I don't really like playing against Infect, or So that's one of those situations where the lines kind of blur between turn 0 threat assessment and the rule 0 or social contract conversations beforehand.
Absolutely. And so sort of in that same vein, our next card that we want to talk about is Golos Tireless Pilgrim, which is another gigantic boogeyman in the format. It has been for a while now. Golos, of course, is most notable for fetching things like Field of the Dead into play when they get cast, and also just being able to pay 7 to rip off whatever you want off the top of your library is pretty good. So to me, this is a different type of strategy that necessitates a way of looking at how this game is going to play out that is very different than a lot of standard games of Magic. It operates on the basis of lands mattering. And unfortunately, through social convention, land removal, even in tiny amounts, isn't typically seen as okay. And that's really unfortunate. And I think in a lot of ways, Golos players kind of take advantage of that. And I think that's why Golos is as popular as they are, in that an entire ability to answer the strategy is essentially removed from almost everyone's decks even before the game starts.
Yeah.
And so especially if you're seeing a Golos deck hit the table, what you really want to be watching out for and looking for yourself are effects that help you slow down multiple color pip generation, right? You want to be able to say, when am I actually going to have to start worrying about Golos? Because in some really aggressive Golos builds, it could be as early as turn 2.
Well, and just tying it back into the whole idea of symmetrical effects not necessarily being symmetrical. This is the kind of situation where if the Golos player already has tons of mana production on the board, whether it's tons of lands like a Cabal Coffers, Urborg, whatever you want to talk about for large land production or mana production, overloading a Cyclonic Rift means that the Golos player is going to get to play Golos again, right? So it's the kind of thing where you kind of have to sit back and make the assessment, like, what is this person trying to do? And is my action going to move them closer to that or further away? Or is it going to be neutral, right? It's very rarely neutral, but sometimes it is. But I would argue if the Golos player is playing Maze's End or something like that, they probably want to cast Golos again from their hand or from the command zone or whatever, right? Like, they don't want it sitting on the battlefield. They want to cast it again. So
it's specifically the kind of card that you definitely don't want to flicker, even if it's to try and avoid damage.
Right, exactly. And so that's the kind of thing where your turn 0 threat assessment comes into play and you're like, well, where do they want this right now? It's the same thing with Maelstrom Wanderer, right? Like, somebody casts Maelstrom Wanderer and hits the board and then they attack you and you're like, well, do I really want to remove that? if I remove it, it puts it back in the command zone, and then they're going to get to cast it again, and they get another double cascade, right? Their deck is designed to take advantage of that, and it's way more advantageous for them to have it in the command zone or in their hand than it is on the battlefield. So Golos, I would say, definitely fits into that category, having a very strong enters the battlefield ability. So that might be something that we can sort of abstract from this episode, is that when you know where somebody wants a card, whether it's in the library, in the graveyard, in the command zone, in their hand, you know, your symmetrical effects, if they put it in that zone where they want that card to be, they're benefiting from your action more than another player might be.
Well, exactly. And I think that actually ties in really well to our next commander, which is Korvold, Faker's King.
Does it ever?
Because if we're being honest, Korvold probably doesn't care if you put 3/4 of his deck in his graveyard. Mm-hmm. Korvold's probably pleased as punch because they can recur things and then resack them and then re-recur things, and over you go. Yeah. Even if it's not Cat Oven like it is in some, I guess not standard anymore, but historic decks, you can still watch cards like this get out of control with the very basic, repeatable reanimator strategies. Yeah. And so...
Well, you know what Korvold does if it's not Cat Oven? It's Dockside Extortionist. You know, it's disgusting, right? Like you've seen this where you cast Dockside Extortionist, you make 7 treasures or whatever, and then they sack it to make 7 mana and draw 7 cards. It's disgusting, right? Mm-hmm. But same thing with this Dockside Extortionist. Where do you want this Dockside Extortionist to be? You know, and this is the kind of thing where your turn 0 threat assessment might say, you know, hey, Korvold is gambling for something, right? You know, it's probably if they don't have the Dockside Extortionist in play, they're probably gambling for the Dockside Extortionist, right? Mm-hmm. So this is one of those kind of situations where it's like, well, maybe you do want to counter the tutor, right? Mm-hmm. Because the Dockside Extortionist is way less accessible to them in the graveyard, in the library than it would be in the graveyard if you let the tutor resolve and counter the Dockside Extortionist, right?
Exactly. Graveyard decks that rely on sacking and then reanimating, or just anything that makes use of the graveyard as a resource, you really need to sort of flip the standard logic of counter the threat rather than the get, right? Because as soon as something makes the battlefield or makes the graveyard for these decks, it doesn't seem to matter. Contrary-wise, it's also a really good argument for running more exile conditional removal. For example, there are several counter spells and damage dealing spells that exile the permanent upon resolution. Yep. And especially if you're playing in a meta where a lot of your friends are playing these sorts of graveyard decks, switching off of something like Mana Drain to something like insert counter spell that exiles here. The point is that being cognizant that your normal styles of removal might not actually hurt someone is going to be very important. And I think graveyard decks is where people sort of fall off of that the most. I think in a lot of ways, graveyard decks are, I don't want to say meta dependent, but they work a lot better against people that aren't expecting to need to interact on the I must exile this to make it go away thing that I think is a little bit more common in that almost getting into high power range where you're really not quite trying to optimize your deck fully, but you're still trying to play very powerfully. And I think especially things like Korvold are kind of banes in that type of range.
Well, I think the other thing that it tends to exploit as well is, what I say is, one of the things that I often talk about when talking about graveyard decks especially is don't remove something just because it sucks, right? So if I've got a Grafdigger's Cage in play, right, and there's a Korvold at the table, and you really want to, I don't know, like Court of Calling something, right? And you're like, man, this Grafdigger's Cage is shutting me down. I just want to Court of Calling my whatever, you know? If my Grafdigger's Cage is pinning down Korvold more than it's pinning down you, it's doing more work at the table than you're recognizing. If all you're focused on is this is what it's stopping me from doing, you have to consider holistically at the table, what is it stopping everybody from doing? And is the thing that's stopping my opponent from doing better than the thing it's stopping me from doing? Because if it is, then I want this to be in play. I might even expend resources to keep it on the table in that situation.
Turns out, Court of Calling for your Dryad Arbor isn't going to be more than having a Grafdigger's Cage to keep Corvold in check.
It's exactly it, right? Like, and maybe not Corvold, but maybe it's like, I don't know, what is the Angel of Jubilation or something like that, or whatever, right? Like,
or like a Maren deck.
Yeah, and such is the case a lot of the time with stacks. Is that not only do you need like good threat assessment to play stacks, that's like an absolute necessity to play the archetype in general. You have to have super good threat assessment, good timing, all that kind of stuff to play it well. You also, a lot of the time, at least from my experience, you have to be a good politician to kind of sell why you need those pieces in play, right? So when somebody's looking at your stuff and they're saying, man, I wish this collector ooh for this, curse totem wasn't in play. You have to say like, no, like this is a good thing that this is here. The game would be over if this piece wasn't here. So I get that it sucks, but if you remove it, this guy's going to win, So you kind of have to be almost a little more vocal about it. And I know not a lot of people, well, maybe not a lot of people, but not everybody loves that. They don't like to be told, how to assess threats, but I found, at least in my experience, it's almost a necessity when you're playing stacks.
Well, and not only that, but I think a lot of what that comes down to is there's a huge difference between you're making an objectively wrong play versus, hey, I've noticed this. This is my rationale. Here's why I expect this. Mm-hmm. I feel like, especially if you're explaining why you want something versus you don't want something, you tend to be way more successful in those sort of political things. Whereas just as someone who got a bit of a reputation back when I used to play more casual Commander for being tricksy, if we're going to be generous with the terminology, if you're always lying or if you're always just trying to be self-serving, that's typically not a great way to build up that type of trust with your play group. Whereas if you're being very honest and forthcoming with the only thing stopping Corvold from winning right now is this Grafdigger's Cage. If you blow it up, we're all going to lose, and here is why. You're probably going to have a better time. Yeah.
Sheldon actually has an article about politics that he wrote for Star City Games, and I'll link it in the show description. But he talks about different kinds of politics, and one of them, actually, I almost got him on one with what he calls the carefully worded contract, where it's like everything that I said is objectively true, but it's like, making a wish with a leprechaun or something like that, where like there's going to be that kind of monkey's paw twist to it. The thing that I almost got him on was, I told him, hey, if you or somebody attacks you, I was making a deal with him. I said, if somebody attacks you, I've got removal and I'll use it on their creature if they attack you. What he didn't know is that my removal was Berserk.
Well, the creature's dead, but so are you.
C'est dommage, So anyway, a little bit of a tangent, but yeah, I totally agree. It's the kind of thing where if you build up a reputation for, either being the type of person that gets extremely irritated when people make incorrect threat assessments, or at least what you perceive to be incorrect threat assessments. And that's tough too, because you don't always have access to the same information that they have, right? They could be ready to win on the spot if they remove this stacks piece that you think is going to let somebody else win, right? And in that case, it's the objectively correct play for them, but you don't know that. Yeah. So yeah, definitely framing is important when you're doing that kind of thing, because, you don't want to rub people the wrong way if you're just trying to have a good time playing Magic.
Exactly. And I think a lot of that just comes down to be affirmative about your own argument, not negative towards other people's arguments.
Bingo.
And so in any case, the last card we want to talk about as a commander today is a newer card that I think is sort of sweeping a lot of places. I've seen a lot of deck lists around this guy. It's Prosper, tome-bound, out of the supplementary Adventures of the Forgotten Realms commander decks.
You want to read this one out?
Absolutely. It's a 4-mana, 2 black-red Tiefling Warlock, 1/4 with Death Touch that says, at the beginning of your end step, exile the top card of your library until the end of your next turn. You may play that card. And whenever you play a card from exile, create a treasure token. Now, initially, when you just start reading this, there, to me anyway, isn't a whole lot of obvious issues. I don't see a lot of very super clear lines that any individual deck is going to take. However, I do notice a couple of things. First off, it doesn't start allowing people to cast things until the beginning of their end step, right? So they're not getting that extra draw at the beginning of turn. It has to sit through the turn cycle before they're going to have access to it. But the second thing I notice is that this is actually in a very aggressive ramping commander. Even if I'm exiling a land off the top of my graveyard with this and I play it, oh, have some free money with your land. Have some free money with your impulse draw. And so I think it's one of those very sneaky value commanders in that it doesn't necessarily line up with traditional value commanders by being extremely obvious about where it's getting its utility, but instead trying to work with a, in my opinion, underexplored avenue. And so I guess my question for you, Jim, is what are some things that you think could be true based on sitting down across from a Prosper deck?
You know, this is the kind of thing where, like, when I look at this card, I see, essentially Phyrexian Arena in the command zone, right? You're drawing 2 cards per turn, effectively, just for having your commander out, right? And then it's got upside. Yes. So not only are you not paying life into it, you are drawing an extra card per turn. I would probably look at, I'm going to be honest with you, I have never seen a Prosper deck yet. I just haven't come across it yet. Adventures of Forgotten Realms has been out for like a couple weeks at this point.
Yeah.
I honestly haven't played against one yet. I haven't seen a deck list. I haven't gone looking, but I haven't seen one. So just that's my preface on this. If I was looking to really lean into the idea that I'm drawing 2 cards per turn, I would probably play symmetrical discard effects. And I don't know if that's the way people have gone with this, but it seems like it would be extremely effective given the fact that, like, if I'm drawing 2 cards per turn and I force everybody to discard a card, I'm up a card on everybody, even if I'm one of the people that discards a card as well. Right.
Well, not only that, but the card that you're putting into exile is discard protected too.
Bingo.
So you don't need to worry about cracking off a mind rot if you're already on 0.
Yep. We can play like Sire of Insanity, stuff like that, where like just have everybody hellbent and then you've got an extra card per turn that you get to play, right? Like you're getting access to twice as many cards as everybody else at the table. It's an asymmetrical effect by nature. And then in addition to that, you're ramping. So,
exactly.
I don't know. That's the way, if I was looking to really lean into this effect, that's probably the way that I would do it. I'm sure there's stuff like initially when I saw this, I was looking at the second ability. I was like, playing cards from exile, you say, that sounds like Food Chain, but this is Rakdos and not Jund. So you can't do that. My second thought was, this sounds like Mnemonic Betrayal, but this is Rakdos and not Grixis. So, it kind of dodges some of the more obvious busted synergies. But I think I would really lean into the first effect and not the second. How would you do it?
So what I would do with this is a sort of 1-2 punch of card advantage by using exile as a second hand. I would pull in cards like Dream Devourer from Kaldheim that gives all non-land cards in your hand foretell. I would play cards like Dothy Voidwalker and Layla, the Blade Reforged. I would also play one of my absolute favorite red cards of all time, Outpost Siege. Because 4 mana, draw a card and get a free floating mana that you can use at any time is wildly good. So,
it just occurred to me that often other impulse draw effects also exile, right? So your often mono red stuff like Light Up the Stage, things like prophetic
Jeska's Will.
Jeska's Will.
The Future.
Prophetic Flame Speaker is like one of my favorite Magic cards of all time, probably my favorite red creature of all time. It just tosses those cards in exile, and like even though I don't know, that seems sweet. I like that a lot.
Well, and not only that, but it also lets us play around with treasure stuff as well, because we're already going to be making so much of it. What if we threw in something like Grim Hireling from AFR that allows us to turn that treasure into removal? And so now I have this really tight mid-range deck that's just going to incrementally keep pounding away at me. And this is the type of card that when I see it, my first thought is how powerful do I think this player has built this deck? Because I think Prosper is the type of card that benefits heavily from synergy and can fall anywhere between. My good friend Steph Quad9s on Twitter sent me an Ice Cauldron.
Oh yeah.
8.5 or 9 card combo using Prosper, and it was hot jank, but it was hilarious, and there was like Academy Mana Factor loops and a whole 9 yards. And I could also see this all the way up to, if not CEDH, very close to CEDH.
Yeah, like solid high power.
Yeah, Sire of Insanity and other effects that are going to be hand attacking people into, like you mentioned earlier, a symmetrical non-symmetry.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so a lot of what cards like this tell me is I need to know my opponent very well. And this is why Rule 0 is so important. Because if everyone has to sit down at a table and treat Prosper like Urza, people who build Ice Cauldron Prosper decks are going to have a bad time.
So do you ever, this maybe is somewhat related, but do you ever revise, like when you sit down at a table and you get a pretty good concept of what everybody at the table is trying to do, right? Do you ever like revise your assessments mid-game? Because if somebody says like, oh, this is jank, and then their turn 1 play is like Volcanic Island, Mox Diamond, Mox Opal, like does that set off alarm bells for you? Or do you like take their word for it that they've like assessed their deck and that those are appropriate cards for the power level of the deck?
So I almost never hold what I would call support cards against people. In my opinion, one of the best parts of Commander is being able to do the thing you set out to do. And if the thing you set out to do is play Ice Cauldron at Prosper, which again is like an 8.5 to 9 card combo, you kind of need to run things like Vampiric Tutor, Imperial Seal, Fast Mana, because otherwise you're never going to get there. And so I'm not going to hold like a mana vault against someone. On the flip side of that, though, if I start seeing objectively powerful effects that I only expect to see from CDH style decks, that's where I'm going to maybe reel it back in. Something like Dockside Extortionist, I don't think qualifies, but there's other effects like Wheels of Fortune in non-mono wheel decks. Effects like, what do I want to say?
Like low cost counter spells, that kind of thing. Like low cost narrow counter spells.
Yes. Yeah. Things that only come about from having to play in the hyper competitive on the stack meta. And so Red Elemental Blast is actually really good.
Yeah, that's a good example.
In my opinion, Red Elemental Blast is a dead card in most red decks, but it's an auto include if you're in red, if you're playing at CDH.
Yeah, or like Mental Misstep, something like that. Like, what are you doing with Mental Misstep in a precon? You know, nothing.
No, it's silly. In fact, it's actively bad at times,
and it's expensive dollar wise, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I think like I would agree with that. I think I would probably tweak it just a little bit. In that a lot of fast mana, the support cards, as you put it, I some of those raise alarm bells to me, but particularly when they involve a trade-off of card advantage for mana acceleration, like a significant trade-off. Things like Chrome Mox, Mox Diamond, like those to me, it's not just ramp. It's like it's a 2-for-1 for the benefit of playing a land early. That's what Mox Diamond is, right? Like you're playing 2 cards to basically play an extra land drop on your first turn. That's like where Mox Diamond shines. That makes me nervous, right? Dark Ritual, Bubbling Muck, High Tide, these things that are like, okay, there's mana advantage here, but it's like bursty mana advantage at the cost of card advantage. And especially if they've got card advantage in the command zone. So like if you're playing something like that in a deck that is designed to draw a lot of cards, and that's the information that you have available to you on Rule 0 or on turn 0, that's the kind of thing that's setting off alarm bells, because it tells me you're looking to dump your hand and then refill it so that you're playing on turn 5 when everybody else is on turn 2.
And I think I agree with you on that. Really what we're looking at when we talk about card advantage is not necessarily strictly the number of cards that are being played, but also the quality of cards that are being played, right? Because it really doesn't matter if I cast, Thrill of Possibility into Cathartic and Reunion into another ramping ritual, for example. That doesn't do anything other than fill my graveyard up. But that takes on a whole different vision if it's in a Lord Windgrace lands deck, right? And so it's mostly about how much does each individual card advance the plan of the person versus the capacity of the person.
Yep.
And so something like Mana Vault or Mana Crypt doesn't necessarily give them any more plan, but it does influence their capacity.
Yeah, and that's Sheldon mentioned that as a concept. He calls it time creep, where it's not necessarily creeping the ceiling of your deck. It's just saying that the stuff that you were doing in the late game before, you're doing in the early game now, right? Or the mid game. So it's like the ceiling.
Or you're doing it more
consistently. Exactly. Yeah. Like the ceiling is the same. It's just kind of bumped the graph a little bit leftward, on time.
Yeah. I think one of the best examples I can bring up in terms of a card that when I see it, I immediately switch from this deck is probably built as they said it was to this deck might be better than even they might suspect it is. Because I think that is actually an important thing, is that I would argue that a fair number of people that pub stomp don't actually realize they're pub stomping.
Oh, big time. Big time. I think it's the majority for sure.
I don't have enough information. I don't really play blind metas that often, and I don't talk to people that do, so I don't really know. But one of those cards that I really see in that space is something like Deflecting SWAT. Because the presence of Deflecting SWAT in a deck says to me that they are the type of player that has not only considered what they are doing, but also what their opponents are doing and how they can manipulate their opponent's resources into being their resources. And I think at that point, regardless of the other cards I've seen, maybe I'm not necessarily saying that, oh, that deck's CEDH now, but I'm going to find your deck more threatening for having seen a card like that. Because it indicates to me that you, as a player, are farther ahead on the overall metacognition that has gone into this game.
Yeah, and like I think that that's a good point, is especially like when we're talking about turn zero threat assessment and revising it mid game, that can even point you towards, I might need to worry about different things than I thought, right? Like if I've got a tutor in my hand, what am I tutoring for? If it's something that's going to save my life because I think the game's about to end, what am I getting, right? Is it going to be graveyard hate? Is it going to be card draw? Like, what do I have to worry about? That's the kind of thing where it's like, if you're not totally familiar with what they're trying to do, you can start like from your starting point of turn zero threat assessment of just like the commander and whatever the person has told you before the game starts. You can kind of use those signposts to say, okay, well, do I have to adjust my strategy? Like, am I likely to be playing against a $2,000 Atraxa deck, or is this going to be an Atraxa precon with some modifications?
Right.
Like I have an Atraxa precon and a dresser upstairs. Theoretically, I could bust it out at any time. But if my first play is a land that, like, if it's Transguild Promenade, I'm not first play, maybe second play. Don't play Transguild Promenade on your first turn.
Well, why not?
But if that's my second land that I play, right, like it's going to give you a totally different assessment of what I'm trying to do with my deck. That my average card value is not going to be a $30 Planeswalker.
Well, and I actually think that that's one of the important reasons why I really do think that judging solely by what you see in the command zone is not necessarily the best way of going about things, especially in a blind group. As much as there are people out there that are going to lie to your face and do those sorts of shady things, I do genuinely believe that the vast majority of players are not out to be rude. They're just out to surprise people. They think that it's going to be fun for somebody to, oh, look at the wacky thing I did, not realizing that that's borderline CEDH or wildly powerful or uninteractable.
Or they've got something that's really fragile and they don't want it to be like very clearly shut down from go, Exactly. Like I've got a deck like that where it's a single point of failure deck. It's fun to play once, but once people know what I'm doing, like it's very easy to disrupt in the very early game, So that's the kind of thing where it's not even high power. It's just, I don't want to tell people just because I don't want to be explicitly hated out of the game by literally any deck in the format,
Right. And I think a lot of this comes back to deciding what is a relevant condition on the board state and what is not a relevant condition on the board state. And maybe we'll talk about this in a different video. But a lot of the times I think people buy into things that either have not happened or will not happen in a game of Commander. And so I think a lot of what you need to look at is not necessarily prognosticating on the basis of prior information, but coupling the prior information you had and whittling out options as you see them.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, one thing that we talk about a lot, well, I mean, I don't know if we talk about it a lot, but I think about it a lot, is the judge concept of collateral truths. When we're looking at investigating someone for cheating, for making a misplay, for doing whatever we're doing, there are certain things that when the player has said, oh, well, I didn't realize X, they might also have information about why they didn't realize X, or they've never seen X before, or it was a foreign language card. And there's all these little pieces that go together with that. And similarly to my way, way earlier example about Atraxa and Interplanar Beacon, being a land that interacts primarily with planeswalkers, if instead you saw something like Gavany Township, seeing one of the two of those come down on an early turn should drastically change the way you approach the deck. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important if someone is telling you, no, my Urza deck is, casual, no, my Urza deck isn't that good. Try to believe them. Don't instantly make them the archenemy. Because making assumptions like that, in a lot of ways, harms the creativity of people that are trying to take quote-unquote boogeyman commanders like the four we've talked about and make them fun.
Yeah. And, I think that there's a pretty clean division that you can make between, the rule zero threat assessment, or not rule zero, turn zero threat assessment that you can do that is likely to come up in the game. Like if I sit down against somebody that's playing the Locust God, right? There's very easy predictions on how that's going to change my contextual analysis of the cards in my hand, right? If I've got a wheel and they've got a Locust God, I'm like, well, maybe I shouldn't do that. Like their deck is probably designed to take advantage of that more than my deck, right? Exactly. If I'm playing Marin, same thing, right? Do I really want to stock a Marin player's graveyard? Maybe not, right? So like there are the kind of like low hanging fruit situations where you can say like my turn zero threat assessment is going to change the way that I play the cards in my hand. But in just about all other situations, like when you're trying to gauge power level or when you're trying to gauge, just about anything else, even strategy, like you say, it's going to be one of those things that you kind of have to build using all of the clues that you get as you're playing the game, Mm-hmm. So definitely be open to changing your mind on that too. Because if you sit down and your preconception of that Urza deck is like, it's an Urza deck, if they sit down and they play their first land and it's a tap land, then maybe you just like take a deep breath, be like, well, maybe it's not one of those kinds of Urza decks. Like you said, like give them the benefit of the doubt, especially if you haven't been given any information that would lead you otherwise, right? Like if they play their first turn and it's like 4-0 drop artifacts or something like that, like, yeah, okay, maybe it's time to start setting off alarm bells. But if their first turn is like island go and their second turn is island go, like, you haven't seen anything yet that's really going to let us set off alarm bells. Like trust but verify,
Yeah. And sort of along with that, what I really want to push home on that specific point is just because you're not afraid of a commander because you haven't seen what it can do yet doesn't mean you need to count something out. Frankly, there could be a Chandler deck out there that is wild, crazy, go nuts. And just because you saw Chandler doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad deck.
Could it be any more CDH?
Right, exactly. But the point I'm really trying to make with this is don't get stuck on anything when you're making your threat assessments. But similarly, don't bring a whole bunch of baggage in that you don't have confirmation of.
Mm-hmm. And baggage of the player as well, right? Like if you've got somebody that it's in your play group and they're notorious for playing high powered decks, like if they're bringing a new deck, like give them the benefit of the doubt. The worst thing that can happen, and I say this to people a lot, right? People get so hung up on like winning or losing or having a bad time or whatever. Like if the worst thing that happens in your night is you lose a game of Magic, like count yourself fortunate. Like it's not the end of the world if you lose a game of Magic. The worst thing that happens is you learn something, right? And this is what, when people get into CDH and they ask me like, what should I do if I'm trying to get into CDH? Like go, first of all, watch a whole bunch of games, read as much as you can, and play a whole bunch of games, lose games, right? Figure out how other people win. That's how you get good. That's how you learn how to like what to look for. when you lose a game, go and think about the last 2 turns of the game. What gave you an indication that you were going to lose in 2 turns, right? Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was something obvious in retrospect. But when you, like if you give somebody the benefit of the doubt, if the absolute worst thing that happens is that you lose the game, that's fine. It's okay.
Worst case scenario, the best thing that happens, or I guess the worst thing that happens, is that either you don't play against them or against that specific deck again. Yeah. It doesn't need to be a thing that has ruined your night. Mm-hmm. It doesn't need to be a capital case.
Yeah, I think we could all, as like a Magic community, we could all get better at losing, honestly.
I think a lot of pros will tell you straight up that number one thing that separates, folks that try to grind at stuff versus folks that end up on the pro tour is an ability to lose a game and gain something. Mm. Right? Because here's the thing. If I lose a game against you and Jan and Elliot, I'm not like pro tour. I haven't gotten knocked out of the MPL, but I have learned a little bit more about how you assess threats and the way I need to build my decks and play my decks to play against you folks.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I think really looking at games, win or lose, as improvement is something that I don't think a lot of non-spikes see in gameplay. And I think that it's one of the aspects of the spike psychographic that could help out every psychographic.
Big time. This has been really interesting. This is kind of a slightly different Spike on the Mic. We're focusing on strategy. This is something that both Alex and I have a whole lot to say about. I used to write articles about this kind of thing, so we might even dredge up some old topics and stuff that I've written about. But if this is something you'd like to see, if you like hearing us talk about strategy, then let us know in the comments. This is the kind of thing where we can kind of do whatever we want in Spike on the Mic, and we're just trying to figure out what works. So if you like it, let me know. If you don't like it, also let me know. But if you have a favorite topic for Spike on the Mics, then also let us know in the comments, because we can definitely do more of that. So any parting thoughts about the topic of threat assessment, Alex?
I think the biggest thing, if you take nothing else away from this video, it is anytime you're trying to do threat assessment, anytime you're trying to figure out who should I attack, where should I go, what should I do, the answer should be based on, I have thought about what this commander is trying to do, and my action will put me further ahead than anyone else at the table.
Yep. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Is that, it's not going to be the same every time either, right? Like, you are not going to be able to say A card plus B commander equals me winning, right? It's going to depend on a whole lot of things that you have to pay attention during the game. And when you play games with intention, knowing the holistic impact of your actions, you're going to not only become a better player, but you're going to be more enjoyable to play against, because you understand that actions have consequences and you are able to accurately predict what the consequences are.
Yeah. In any case, folks, thanks for listening to us ramble. I had a great time, and we'll see you on the next one.
See ya. Hey, thank you for checking out the Spike Feeders on YouTube. If you're not subscribed yet, make sure you hit that subscribe button before you close the window, or you can click on this link to check out our other great videos.